America loves a fairy tale, especially one packaged neatly in a feminist bow and printed across the glossy cover of a business magazine. People assume monsters have horns. They assume monsters have fangs. Or at the very least, they assume a monster smells like cheap whiskey and swings his fists in some rundown alley. But trust me on this. In the golden hills of Silicon Valley, monsters don't wear black cloaks. Monsters wear $5,000 cashmere sweaters the color of oatmeal. Monsters smile with perfect, veneered teeth for the cameras. And monsters give TED Talks about protecting mental health inside a marriage. I spent 30 years hunting men and women who lied for a living. Corporate embezzlers. Ponzi architects. I could smell a lie the second it left someone's mouth. The way their pupils would flicker before the sentence even finished forming. And still, I let someone I loved walk straight into a prison built entirely out of soft, loving words and smart home technology. His phone was taken away because he needed to detox from screens. He was banned from driving because of a severe anxiety disorder that had apparently appeared overnight. Every single restriction sounded medical, reasonable, loving. Everyone around us said how lucky he was to have a wife devoted enough to manage a partner who was, in their words, fragile. Then, at exactly 3:14 in the morning, my phone lit up on the nightstand. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't a text begging for help. It was a notification from an ancient banking app neither of us had used in over a decade. A leftover account from years ago, one we'd both forgotten even existed. A deposit had landed in my account, the amount exactly 1 cent. The memo line, a string of numbers and letters that meant absolutely nothing to a stranger. But to the two of us, engineers by trade, it meant everything. It was a code we had built together, a promise from a lifetime ago. If you're ever silenced, if every phone and every door is taken from you, send this. I'll come. He wasn't resting peacefully like she claimed. He wasn't recovering. He was locked inside a glass mansion with cameras in every corner, and somebody had just spent the last ounce of freedom they had left to type 4 impossible words into a banking terminal. The pistol in my nightstand drawer hadn't been touched in 15 years. That night, the oil finally got put back to use. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now, because you do not want to miss where this one is going. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. And if stories like this hit you right in the chest, smash that like button so more people like you find this channel. Now let's get into it. My name is Raymond Ashcombe. I'm 62 years old, and for 30 years I hunted financial predators for a living. The kind of men and women who could smile at you while quietly emptying your bank account, who could sit across an interrogation table and cry real tears over a lie they'd rehearsed 100 times. I retired 4 years ago. I thought the ugliest thing I'd ever have to look at again was a spreadsheet full of fraud. I was wrong. The ugliest thing I ever had to look at was my own son's wedding photo. His name is Derek, my only child. A quiet, brilliant kid who used to take apart computers in our garage before he could even ride a bike without training wheels. He built a cybersecurity company from a laptop and a folding table when he was 26, and by 30, he was being called one of the sharpest minds in Silicon Valley, the kind of engineer that larger firms tried to poach. With absurd salaries he always turned down. He was never loud, never flashy. He just worked, quietly, brilliantly, and he trusted people far too easily, because he'd never once learned how to spot the kind of predator who doesn't carry a weapon, only a smile and a calendar full of charity galas. Then he met Selena Cole. Selena was 32, radiant, magnetic, the kind of woman who could walk into a boardroom and have every man in the room forget what quarter they were even discussing. She ran her own startup, something involving predictive analytics for venture funds, and within 2 years of meeting Derek, she was gracing the cover of a national business magazine under a headline that made me want to throw the whole issue across the room. The woman who understood love beyond money. The article painted her as a saint, a visionary CEO who had fallen for a socially awkward genius plagued by anxiety and who had selflessly rearranged her empire to care for him. Friends of ours actually said it to my face at a dinner party. Derek is so lucky. Not every woman would put up with someone like him. Put up with him, as if my son were a burden to be tolerated rather than a human being to be loved, a man to be endured rather than cherished. I smiled and nodded that night, because that's what you do at dinner parties, but something in my chest had already started to curdle. I should have caught it sooner. God help me, I should have caught it in the first 6 months. It started small, subtle, the kind of thing that, taken individually, sounds almost sweet, almost thoughtful. Derek stopped answering his personal cell phone because Selena had convinced him a digital detox would help with his stress levels. Then he stopped driving entirely because she said his anxiety made him a danger behind the wheel. Never mind that he'd driven without a single incident for 15 years. Never mind that he used to drive cross-country alone just to clear his head. Then, one by one, his old friends from college and from his early startup days stopped hearing from him, each disappearance wrapped in a perfectly reasonable, perfectly loving explanation. He was recovering. He was focusing on his mental health. He was taking space to heal from burnout. Every excuse was medical. Every restriction was framed as an act of love. And because Selena delivered these explanations with such warmth, such convincing tenderness in interviews and in person, nobody around us ever thought to ask the obvious question: since when does love require isolating someone from every single person who loves them back? I noticed the changes in stages, the way you notice a tide pulling out, slow, and then all at once, until you're standing on dry sand, wondering where the ocean went. The company Derek had built with his own 2 hands, the one he'd bled over for years, quietly restructured so that Selena's family office and her own holding company held majority control of the board. He signed the papers himself, she told me, during a difficult period when he needed someone strong to handle the business side while he focused on getting better. I asked to see those papers once at a family dinner, my voice as casual as I could manage. She smiled at me over a glass of wine and told me Derek's lawyer had everything filed properly and that I shouldn't worry myself with things that weren't really my business anymore. Not my business, my own son's company, the one he built from nothing, not my business. I called Derek directly after that conversation. He answered, but his voice sounded flat, distant, like a man reading lines from a script somebody else had written for him. He told me everything was fine. He told me Selena was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He told me I was overreacting like always, like you used to overreact about every deal at work. And then, politely, almost mechanically, he asked if we could talk another time, because he wasn't feeling well and needed to rest. I hung up the phone that night and sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, the refrigerator humming in the silence. Something in my gut, the same instinct that had let me spot 1,000 liars across 1,000 interrogation tables, was screaming at me. But I had no evidence, no proof, just a father's dread. And in this country, a father's dread doesn't hold up in any courtroom, doesn't earn you a warrant, doesn't get you past a front gate. Weeks turned into months. Our calls grew shorter, spaced further and further apart, always monitored, always cut off the moment the conversation edged toward anything real. Every time I pushed, even gently, even carefully, Selena would appear in the background of the call with impeccable, almost rehearsed timing, her voice soft as silk. He needs to rest, Raymond. The doctor was very clear about minimizing stress and outside pressure right now. I started to dread the sound of her voice more than I've ever dreaded anything in 30 years of chasing criminals through courtrooms and depositions. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because it matters. This isn't a story about a difficult daughter-in-law. This isn't a story about personality clashes or awkward holidays or in-law drama. This is a story about a predator who identified a vulnerable, brilliant, trusting man, and who spent years constructing an invisible cage around him using nothing but concern, medicine, and the language of love as her building materials. And because society still can't fully picture a woman as the architect of that kind of cruelty, because we're trained from childhood to picture abuse as a fist, not a whisper, nobody around us saw it happening. Nobody except me. And even I didn't act fast enough. Even I let 2 more years slip by while telling myself I was imagining things. That brings me to the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way until it wasn't. I was sitting in my recliner, half asleep, in front of a rerun of some old crime documentary, my phone charging on the side table the way it did every single night. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, that phone buzzed against the wood with a sound sharp enough to snap me fully awake, heart already pounding before my eyes had even focused. It wasn't a call, it wasn't a text. It was a notification from an old banking app, one Derek and I had set up together back when he was in college, a joint account we'd both forgotten still technically existed, buried under a decade of newer accounts and newer banks. The notification read simply, a deposit had been received, the amount, 1 cent. I stared at that number for a full 3 seconds before my brain caught up with what I was looking at. 1 cent meant nothing to anyone in the entire world, except that Derek and I, both engineers at heart, had built a private language for exactly this kind of moment, years earlier, half as a joke and half out of a paranoia bred from my old career. If you're ever cut off, if every phone is taken, every door locked, every voice silenced, send exactly 1 cent with this memo attached, and I will come, no questions asked. I opened the transaction details with hands that had gone suddenly, completely cold. The memo line read, Fatal error Sulhuro X00. It wasn't gibberish to me. It was the exact phrase we'd agreed on a decade ago, back when Derek was 24, and I was still working active fraud cases, back when neither of us imagined he'd ever actually need it. It meant one thing, and one thing only. I am not okay, and I cannot say so out loud. Come now. I didn't call him. Calling would have gone straight to her, would have given her time to prepare, to smooth things over, to reload her explanation. I didn't call the police either. Not yet, because I had spent 30 years watching how slowly bureaucracy moves and how quickly a clever liar with a magazine cover and a room full of donors can spin a story before the truth ever catches up. I did the only thing that felt right in that moment. I walked to my bedroom closet, pulled the small safe from the back shelf, and took out the Glock 19 I hadn't touched in 15 years. I loaded it methodically, the way training never quite lets you forget, and I called a car to take me straight to Palo Alto. My son had just spent what might have been his very last ounce of freedom to send me 4 words disguised as a banking error. I intended to make absolutely certain it wasn't wasted. The drive to Palo Alto took 43 minutes that felt like 4 hours. I spent every single one of them running through old case files in my head, cataloging every technique I'd ever watched a predator use to isolate a victim, and realizing with a sick, sinking feeling that Selena Cole had used almost every single one of them, dressed up in the language of a devoted, loving spouse. I'd chased embezzlers who spent years earning a victim's trust one small favor at a time. I'd chased Ponzi architects who wrapped their lies in the language of family and community, but I had never once imagined I'd be applying those same instincts to my own son's marriage, at 3 a.m, with a loaded gun on the passenger seat beside me. The car dropped me at the end of a long, curved driveway, lined with imported olive trees, each one lit from below by soft, tasteful landscape lighting that probably cost more than most people's cars. The house itself rose up out of the hillside like something out of an architecture magazine, all glass, steel, and poured concrete, a monument to minimalism that looked less like a family home and more like a corporate headquarters that had wandered off and decided to live somewhere quiet, somewhere private, somewhere nobody could see inside. I stood at the base of that driveway for a moment, just staring. Every window was dark except for a faint, cold blue glow coming from somewhere deep inside. The kind of light that comes from screens, not lamps, not a home where people actually rest. I counted 4 visible security cameras before I'd even reached the front steps, their small red indicator lights blinking in patient mechanical rhythm, watching the driveway, watching the walkway, watching me. This wasn't a home. It was a surveillance system with furniture inside it. A glass cage dressed up as a dream house on the cover of a real estate magazine. And my son was somewhere inside it, sending distress signals through a decade-old banking app, because every other door, every phone, every friend had already been sealed shut, around him one polite excuse at a time. Derek had given me an emergency override code years earlier, back before things had gotten this bad, back when he still had the freedom to think about contingencies, like a rational, cautious engineer, instead of a man being slowly, methodically worn down. He'd set it up on the smart lock as a joke between us, something he called, "in case the house ever tries to eat me." We'd laughed about it back then, 2 engineers building a paranoid little safety net neither of us believed we'd ever actually need. I hadn't thought about that code in years. I typed it into the panel by the front door with fingers that weren't quite steady, half expecting it to fail, half expecting alarms to shriek through the hillside and wake every wealthy neighbor within a mile. The lock clicked open in silence. I stepped inside before the system could reconsider, moving fast and low, the way old training never quite leaves your body, sweeping the front hall with my eyes the way I used to sweep a room before an arrest. Everything gleamed. Everything was white or gray, or that particular shade of beige that decorators like to call warm neutral, even though there's nothing warm about it at all. There were no photographs on the walls, no clutter, no sign that 2 actual human beings lived here, laughed here, fought here, built a life together here. It looked like a showroom. It looked like nobody had ever spilled coffee on that pristine white sofa in the great room, because nobody who lived inside these walls was allowed to be anything less than perfect, anything less than presentable. That's when I heard her voice, calm and unhurried, drifting out from the kitchen like she'd been expecting company all along. "Raymond, I wasn't expecting you at this hour." Selina stood at the marble island, in a silk robe the color of champagne, one hand wrapped loosely around the stem of a wine glass, as though I'd interrupted a quiet evening rather than shown up armed at 3 a.m. after her husband's desperate, coded cry for help. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup somehow, at this hour, was still perfect. Her expression was perfectly composed, perfectly patient, the expression of someone who has rehearsed calm for exactly this kind of moment over and over in front of a mirror. "Where's my son?" I said. Not a question. I wasn't in the mood for questions. She sighed the exact sigh a nurse gives a difficult, confused patient, and set her glass down with a soft, deliberate click against the marble countertop. "He's asleep, Raymond. It's the middle of the night. Whatever this is, whatever's gotten into you, it can wait until morning. He sent me a message at 3:14. Something flickered behind her eyes, so fast I almost missed it. A flash of calculation quickly smoothed back over with practiced concern. "He's been very confused lately, honestly. The doctor increased his dosage last week, and it can cause some disorientation, some strange, erratic behavior. I really think you should let me handle this the way we've been handling it. You're understandably worried, Raymond. You're his father. But you're not seeing the full clinical picture here." There it was. The bait she'd been dangling in front of every single person in our lives for the last 3 years. And I watched, in real time, as she tried to dangle it in front of me too. The suggestion that I was the unstable one, the reactive one, the paranoid old man too consumed by suspicion to see the loving, careful medical support his son was supposedly receiving. I'd interviewed enough liars across enough tables to recognize the rhythm of a well-worn script the moment I heard one, and this was a script she had clearly performed for an audience before. "What doctor?" I asked. "Give me a name. Give me a license number." "Raymond, please, you're spiraling. This isn't like you." Her voice dropped into something gentler, something almost maternal, the exact tone I imagined she used on every board member who ever dared question her numbers, every reporter who ever pushed too hard in an interview. "I understand this is hard. Watching your son need help, needing someone else to be the strong one for him for once. I know that's difficult for a man like you, a man who spent his whole career being the one in control. But he's safe here. He's cared for. He's loved, more than you seem to realize, more than you've ever given me credit for. I want to be clear about something because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. This is the exact language modern predators use. Not fists, not slammed doors, not screaming matches the neighbors can hear through thin apartment walls. They use concern. They use medical necessity. They use the vocabulary of therapy and healing and boundaries, weaponized so precisely that anyone listening from the outside hears nothing but a devoted partner doing the hard, thankless work of caretaking. It's gaslighting refined into an art form, packaged for an audience that has been culturally trained to believe that a soft voice, dressed in silk and standing in a marble kitchen, could never be a violent one. "I want to see him," I said. "Right now. Tonight." Selina studied me for a long moment, the way I imagined she studied balance sheets before a funding round, calculating, patient, looking for the angle that would cost her the least. Then she smiled, small and cold, a smile that never once reached her eyes, and reached for her phone on the counter with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once lost control of a room in her life. "Of course," she said sweetly. "But Raymond, I really do think it's time we called someone who can help mediate this properly. Someone official, before this gets out of hand. You're not thinking clearly right now, and I won't let you upset him in this state. Not after everything he's already been through." I should have known right then exactly what someone meant. I should have known she wasn't calling a doctor. I glanced past her shoulder, down the darkened hallway that led deeper into the house, toward a staircase lit only by the faint glow of embedded floor lighting, the kind installed so a person could find their way to a bathroom at night without ever needing to turn on a lamp, without ever needing to make a sound. Somewhere up there, behind one of those closed doors, was my son. A man who used to argue with me for hours about processor architecture over cold pizza, who used to call me on my birthday before I even had a chance to check the calendar, who was now apparently too fragile, too confused, too erratic to be trusted with his own cell phone. I thought about the code sitting on my banking app. Fatal error, 0x00. 4 impossible words engineered by 2 people who loved each other enough to build a private language for exactly this kind of night. Whatever Selina was about to orchestrate with that phone call, whatever performance she was preparing to give for the officers who would inevitably arrive at her gate, I intended to make sure it collided head-on with 30 years of instinct that told me, without a single shred of doubt, that I was standing inside a crime scene dressed up as a dream home. She was calling the police, and she was about to become the victim in her own story before I ever got the chance to tell mine. The patrol car arrived 11 minutes later, its headlights sweeping across the driveway in slow, deliberate arcs, followed by a second unit not far behind it. 2 officers stepped out, and I recognized the particular ease in their posture immediately. The relaxed, familiar body language of men who had been to this address before, who knew the person answering the door on a first-name basis, who had probably enjoyed a glass of wine at one of Selina's charity galas at some point in the last 2 years. That's when I understood the true scope of what I was up against. Selina Cole wasn't just wealthy. She was a name on donor plaques at the community center, a name on scholarship funds at the local high school, a name the department itself had likely thanked publicly at some fundraising dinner for underwriting new patrol equipment. In a town like this, money doesn't just buy silence. It buys reputation, And reputation, I've learned across 30 years of chasing liars for a living, is the single most effective weapon a predator can ever own. Far more effective than any weapon I had loaded into my own holster that night. By the time the officers reached the front steps, Selina had already transformed. The calm, composed woman in the champagne silk robe was gone, replaced by something the two men in uniform clearly found far more sympathetic. A trembling, tearful wife, one hand pressed to her chest, voice cracking on cue with a precision that would have been genuinely impressive if it hadn't been so monstrous, so calculated down to the exact rhythm of her breathing. "I'm so sorry to call you out here this late," she said, her eyes glistening in the porch light, catching it at exactly the right angle. "My father-in-law has a history of instability. He showed up unannounced, agitated, and he's armed. I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified for my husband, and honestly, terrified for myself. I watched with a strange, detached fascination, as 30 years of professional instinct told me exactly what was happening in real time, and I still couldn't stop it from happening." The senior officer's hand moved instinctively toward his belt. His partner's eyes flicked to me with new, sudden suspicion, cataloging my age, my posture, the outline of the holster beneath my jacket that I hadn't even bothered to hide, because I hadn't come here expecting to need to hide anything from anyone. I came here to help my son. Instead, in the span of about 90 seconds, I had become the threat in someone else's carefully constructed, expertly performed narrative. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the residence," the officer said, and I recognized the tone immediately. Measured, cautious, the tone reserved for a potentially unstable individual, not a concerned father who had driven 40 minutes in the middle of the night because his son begged him to. I complied, hands visible, every movement slow and deliberate, because I knew better than almost anyone alive exactly how quickly a misread gesture can end a night in tragedy instead of rescue. "I'm not the danger here," I said, as calmly as I could manage, my voice steadier than I felt. "My son sent me a distress signal 4 hours ago, a coded message. I need someone just to actually check on him, to actually look at him, before you decide who the victim is tonight." Selina's laugh was soft, almost pitying, exactly calibrated to make me sound unhinged in front of an audience already primed to see me that way. "Raymond, please. Derek is asleep. He's been asleep for hours. You know that. Everyone knows how he's been lately." That's when the front door opened again, and Derek appeared at the top of the entryway steps, and every ounce of composure I'd been holding on to nearly shattered on the spot. He looked like a ghost of the man I'd raised. His hair was unwashed, hanging limp against a face that had lost so much weight. His cheekbones jutted out sharply beneath hollow, glassy eyes that seemed to struggle to focus on anything at all. He moved slowly, unsteadily. One hand braced against the doorframe, as though gravity itself had become an unfamiliar, hostile force. He was relearning how to fight. This wasn't a man recovering from anxiety. This was a man whose body had been chemically dismantled, piece by piece, over months, maybe years, and I felt something in my chest crack wide open at the sight of him, something that hadn't cracked in 30 years of looking at far worse things. Selina moved instantly, gliding to his side with a performance of tenderness so seamless it nearly fooled even me for half a second, until I saw her fingers close around his forearm with a grip that was just slightly too tight, just slightly too controlling, the kind of hold you'd use to steady a marionette rather than comfort a husband you claim to love more than anything in the world. "Tell them you're okay, sweetheart," she murmured, loud enough for the officers to hear, soft enough to sound intimate rather than instructive, a master class in performing for 2 audiences at once. "Tell your father you just need rest, and that everything here is fine." Derek's mouth opened. His eyes found mine across the driveway, and for one brief, agonizing moment, I saw something flicker behind that glassy, drugged stare. Recognition. Maybe even fear. Maybe even the faint ghost of the boy who used to run into my arms after school with a scraped knee. Then his gaze drifted, unfocused, back toward the ground, and he mumbled something too quiet for anyone to make out clearly, and the senior officer nodded, satisfied, as though 4 slurred syllables had settled the entire matter once and for all. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it's the ugliest part of this entire night. A visibly frail, visibly drugged man stood in front of 2 trained police officers, and instead of asking a single follow-up question, instead of noticing the way his pupils had swallowed nearly the entire color of his eyes, instead of noticing the tremor in his hands, they simply accepted the wife's narrative and turned their attention back toward escorting the unstable father off the property. Because in this country, we still can't fully picture a man as a victim of domestic abuse, especially not from a woman this beautiful, this articulate, this photogenic, this generous with her donor checks. Society has spent generations building the image of a frightened woman fleeing a violent man. Nobody ever built an image for what I was looking at that night. A broken man, chemically silenced, standing beside the very person destroying him, while the system designed to protect him looked directly past it, blinded by a well-tailored robe and a magazine cover. "Sir, we're going to need you to leave the premises," the officer repeated, his patience visibly thinning, his hand still hovering close to his belt. "If you don't comply, we will place you under arrest. And I don't think that's what you want tonight." I looked at Selina one last time before I turned to go. She wasn't even bothering to hide the satisfaction in her eyes anymore. Not for me, though she kept the tears glistening perfectly, for the officers still watching her every move. She had won this round, and she knew it. And worse, far worse, she knew that I knew it too. But she didn't know what was already in motion. She didn't know that 3 days earlier, after months of quiet, careful groundwork, after weeks of pulling old favors and reading financial filings late into the night, I had placed a phone call of my own, not to a lawyer, not to a family therapist, but to a federal agent I'd worked alongside for nearly a decade, a man who specialized in exactly the kind of financial architecture Selina Cole had spent years quietly building around my son's stolen company. I got back into my car and I didn't drive home. I drove 3 blocks, parked beneath a flickering street lamp, and I waited, watching the glass house glow faintly in my rearview mirror, and I dialed a number I hadn't needed to use in 4 years. While the phone rang, I thought about everything I'd just witnessed, cataloging it the way I used to catalog evidence before a deposition. 2 trained officers, sworn to protect and serve, had stood 8 feet away from a man who could barely hold himself upright, and not one of them had asked to see his eyes up close. Not one of them had asked when he'd last spoken to anyone outside that house. Not one of them had asked why a healthy, 34-year-old man needed his wife's hand, gripping his arm just to stay standing on his own front steps. They had looked at a beautiful, tearful, generous woman, and they had looked at an old man with a gun, and they had made their decision in under 4 minutes. That's the machinery Selina had built for herself, piece by piece, donor check by donor check, gala appearance by gala appearance. It wasn't just a house with cameras in every corner. It was an entire ecosystem constructed to make sure that if anyone ever tried to pull Derek out of that glass cage, the system itself would rise up to defend the cage instead of the man trapped inside it. I understood, sitting there in the dark with my hands still shaking slightly on the steering wheel, that I couldn't fight her with instinct alone anymore. I couldn't fight her with a gun, and I certainly couldn't fight her with local police who already owed her their gratitude. I needed federal weight. I needed someone whose badge didn't answer to a county sheriff who'd shaken Selina's hand at a ribbon-cutting ceremony 6 months earlier. The line finally connected, and a familiar, gravelly voice answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake despite the hour, as though he'd been half expecting this call for days. "Ashcombe," the voice said, "tell me you're finally ready to move." "Agent Whitman," I said, "I need you to move on Selina Cole. Tonight, if you can manage it, or as close to tonight as the law allows." Marcus Whitman and I had worked white-collar fraud cases together for the better part of a decade before I retired. The kind of cases that took years to build and seconds to collapse if you moved too early, too loudly, or with too little paper behind you. He'd been the one agent who never once dismissed my instincts. Even back when I was chasing hunches, other investigators laughed off in the break room. When I'd called him 3 days earlier, laying out everything I'd quietly pieced together about Derek's company, about the sudden board restructuring, about a psychiatrist whose license I couldn't find in any state database, no matter how many hours I spent searching, he hadn't laughed either. He'd simply asked me to keep talking. "I've got a preliminary warrant application drafted," he said now, his voice low and steady over the phone. "But I need probable cause that holds up in front of a judge, not just a father's gut feeling, Raymond, even a father with your resume. What do you actually have on paper?" I told him everything, standing beside my car in the dark, watching that glass house glow faintly 2 blocks away like some kind of cold, patient beacon. I told him about the prescription bottles I'd glimpsed once, months earlier, during one of the rare visits Selina hadn't managed to fully supervise. Bottles labeled with a compounding pharmacy name instead of a hospital pharmacy. Bottles marked for a proprietary cognitive wellness blend, rather than any medication with an actual, searchable, FDA-recognized name. I told him about the doctor Selina kept referencing whenever anyone questioned Derek's condition, a Dr. Reginald Holloway, whose name didn't appear on the state medical board's public website under any specialty, under any active license number. No matter how many databases I combed through during 3 sleepless nights at my kitchen table, I told him what mattered most of all, the timeline. 18 months after the wedding, Derek had been quietly declared, in a private filing buried among routine estate paperwork, to be facing significant health-related limitations to his executive decision-making capacity. 18 months, and that timeline lined up, almost to the week, with the moment Selina's own venture fund had begun quietly negotiating a valuation for a predictive AI algorithm Derek had spent 4 years building from scratch, an algorithm that, according to 2 industry analysts I'd spoken with off the record, was potentially worth well over $1 billion once fully deployed and licensed. A man deemed unfit to make his own decisions doesn't get to negotiate that kind of valuation himself. His medical power of attorney does. And Selina, it turned out, had quietly filed the paperwork to become exactly that 11 months earlier, buried inside a stack of routine legal documents Derek had apparently signed during what she later described, to anyone who asked, as a particularly difficult week. "That's not a marriage," Whitman said quietly, once I'd finished laying it all out. "That's a hostile corporate acquisition wearing a wedding ring." By dawn, Whitman had what he needed. A judge reviewing the pharmacy discrepancies, the missing medical license, and financial records, showing Selina's company had quietly moved to restructure ownership of Derek's algorithm within days of that private diagnosis, signed off on a warrant that would let federal agents examine both the medical claims and the financial trail simultaneously, in one coordinated sweep. It wasn't a slow-moving civil dispute anymore, the kind that drags through family court for years while a victim suffers in silence. It was a federal fraud investigation, and it finally had teeth. I went back to that glass house at 9 in the morning, not with a gun this time, but with Agent Whitman and 2 of his colleagues beside me, and a warrant that Selina Cole could not simply smile her way past, no matter how many donor plaques bore her name. She answered the door still in that same composed, camera-ready expression, though I watched it falter, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, at the sight of federal credentials instead of a father's desperation standing on her porch. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, glancing quickly between the 3 agents, her voice pitched perfectly for an audience that wasn't buying it this time. "Derek is resting. Whatever misunderstanding happened last night can surely be cleared up without all of this." "Ma'am, we have a warrant to inspect prescription records and financial documentation Related to your husband's medical and business affairs, Whitman said, his voice flat, procedural, utterly unmoved by the marble floors or the champagne silk robe she'd apparently kept on for 2 days straight as armor. We'd also like to speak with Derek Ashcombe directly, and we'll be asking him some questions without you present in the room. For the first time since I'd known her, I watched Selina's composure genuinely crack. Not the calculated near tears from the night before, but something colder, sharper, something closer to real panic, wearing thin patience as a mask that was finally slipping. He's not well enough to be interviewed alone. His anxiety, his medication, you don't understand his condition. We're aware of his medication, Whitman said evenly. That's rather the entire point of our visit this morning. The prescription bottles, when we found them locked inside a cabinet in a downstairs bathroom. Derek apparently wasn't permitted to enter without supervision, told a story more damning than even I had prepared myself for. A cocktail combining high-dose stimulants with heavy sedatives, mixed in specific, alternating patterns, clearly designed to produce exactly the symptoms Selina had described to everyone around us for months. The disorientation, the exhaustion, the emotional volatility she'd repeatedly blamed on an anxiety disorder that had never once been formally diagnosed by any licensed, verifiable physician anyone could actually locate. Whitman's team traced the source within hours. Dr. Reginald Holloway, it turned out, had surrendered his medical license 11 years earlier following a serious malpractice case, and had spent the years since quietly writing off-book prescriptions for wealthy clients willing to pay in cash and keep his name off any official file. Selina had been paying him, according to financial records, seized that same afternoon, through carefully disguised consulting fees routed through her venture fund, cleverly labeled on every invoice as Wellness Advisory Services. She hadn't just isolated my son from the world piece by piece. She had been chemically engineering his decline in slow, deliberate increments, carefully calibrated to look like a naturally worsening medical condition rather than a calculated crime. Also, she could accumulate exactly enough legal authority to seize permanent, unquestioned control over both his fortune and the billion-dollar algorithm he'd spent his life building in a garage, not unlike the one he'd grown up in, tinkering beside his father on weekends. "You did this," I said to her, standing in that sterile kitchen while agents moved through her home with evidence bags and cameras of their own. "You didn't fall in love with a fragile man who needed care. You built one piece by piece, prescription by prescription, because a healthy, capable Derek would have never once agreed to sign his own company away." While 2 agents cataloged the pharmacy cabinet, Whitman pulled me aside near the entryway, keeping his voice low enough that Selina, still hovering near the kitchen island under the watchful eye of a 3rd agent, couldn't hear. "There's something else," he said, sliding a printed spreadsheet toward me. "We pulled the venture fund's cap table last night. 2 weeks before that power of attorney filing, Selina personally wired $40,000 to an account registered under Holloway's shell consulting firm. 2 weeks, Raymond? Not months. 2 weeks before she needed the paperwork to hold up in court." I stared at the numbers, feeling something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the air conditioning humming through the vents above us. $40,000 wasn't a bribe paid in a moment of panic. It was a budget line. It was planned, itemized, approved the way any other business expense gets approved. Because to Selina, that's exactly what it was. A line item in the acquisition of my son's mind. "There's more," Whitman continued, flipping to a 2nd page. "Emails between Selina and her own general counsel, discussing accelerating the capacity determination ahead of a Series C funding round that specifically required a single, unencumbered decision-maker at the top of the company. Her lawyers advised her in writing that a legally incapacitated spouse under her medical power of attorney would simplify due diligence for investors." She wrote back one word: "Perfect." I read that word twice, then a 3rd time, my hands tightening around the edge of the printed page until the paper creased. Perfect. Not a woman driven by desperation, not a caretaker who'd made a terrible, understandable mistake trying to manage an overwhelming situation. A CEO optimizing a hostile takeover of her own husband's mind the same way she might optimize a supply chain, treating his deterioration as a line item that improved her fundraising deck. I looked back toward the kitchen, where Selina stood with her arms crossed, watching agents move through drawers and cabinets she'd never once expected a stranger to open. Her composure was gone now, replaced by the flat, calculating stare of someone recalculating odds in real time, searching for an exit that no longer existed. Selina's mask finally, fully slipped, and what emerged from underneath it was something I hadn't yet seen in 3 years of watching her perform. What emerged from underneath that mask wasn't fear, and it wasn't guilt. It was rage, pure and unfiltered, the kind of rage a person only shows once every carefully constructed lie has finally, completely run out of road to travel down. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for him," Selina hissed, rounding on me, while the agents continued cataloging evidence around us, seemingly unbothered by an audience now that pretense no longer served any purpose. "Do you have any idea what it's like, carrying an entire company, an entire relationship, on your back because the man you married is too weak to function without someone managing every single detail of his life? He can't even choose his own breakfast without spiraling into a panic attack. Without me, he's nothing. He's a washed-up engineer with good ideas and zero ability to execute any of them in the real world." Every word landed like a blow, but not the kind of blow that made me angrier at Derek. The kind that made the true shape of her contempt for him finally, fully visible, stripped bare of every carefully rehearsed soundbite she'd ever given a magazine profile about caring for a partner with anxiety. This wasn't love that had curdled under pressure. This had never once been love at all. It was ownership, dressed up in a wedding gown for 2 years running, and I had watched an entire community applaud her for it. That's when I heard footsteps on the staircase, slow, deliberate, each one clearly costing enormous, visible effort. Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing with both hands, his knuckles white with the effort of standing upright without any assistance for what might have been the first time in months. He looked even worse in daylight than he had the night before, gaunt, hollow-eyed, swaying slightly with each step, but something in his expression had changed. The glassy blankness from the night before had been replaced by something sharper, something clawing its way back up through whatever chemical fog Selina had been feeding him for years, something that looked almost like my son again. "Derek, go back upstairs," Selina snapped, her voice suddenly losing every trace of its practiced warmth. "You're not well enough to be down here. You're only going to embarrass yourself." "I heard you," Derek said. His voice was hoarse, cracked, barely above a whisper, but every word landed in that kitchen like a gunshot. "Through the vents in my room. I heard everything you just said to my father." Selina's face drained of color for the first time since I'd walked back into that house the night before. Derek took another unsteady step down, refusing the hand one of the agents offered to help steady him, his jaw set with a stubbornness I recognized instantly, the exact same stubbornness that had once kept him coding through 3 consecutive all-nighters to fix a bug nobody else believed was fixable. "I'm not confused," he said louder now, forcing the words out through what was clearly enormous physical effort. "I'm not having a breakdown and I'm not spiraling. I've been drugged deliberately for months, maybe longer, and I want to press charges right now, today." The room went completely silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant click of an agent's camera documenting the pharmacy cabinet in the next room. Selina's composure detonated entirely. "You ungrateful, pathetic excuse for a man," she spat. All pretense finally abandoned, her voice climbing into something raw and vicious that I suspect very few people had ever heard directed at another human being in their entire lives. Without me, you would have died alone in that garage, coding useless software nobody wanted to buy. I built you. I built your entire public image, your entire reputation. And this is how you repay me, siding with your washed-up father against the only person who ever actually managed to keep you functional? I watched two federal agents exchange a brief, pointed glance, both of them clearly recognizing exactly what they were witnessing. A woman who, stripped of her audience and her leverage, had just delivered a confession disguised as an insult, revealing with startling clarity precisely how she viewed her own husband. Not a partner, a project, a liability to be managed, medicated, and monetized line by line, quarter by quarter. Derek didn't flinch at the insult, though I could see it cost him something enormous to hold his ground against her. Instead, he turned toward Agent Whitman, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, sweat beading along his hairline from the sheer physical effort of remaining upright. "Check the server room," he said. "In the basement. It's the only room in this entire house without a camera or a microphone installed anywhere inside it. I made sure of that myself, years ago, back before she started monitoring absolutely everything else in this house. That's where I sent the transfer from. That's the only place I could." Whitman nodded to one of his colleagues, who disappeared down a narrow staircase I hadn't even noticed on my first pass through the house the night before, moving fast, boots echoing against concrete steps. What they found down there, over the following hour, painted the most complete and damning picture yet. Selina had installed heart rate sensors embedded directly into the mattress of their shared bedroom, tracking Derek's sleep patterns and stress responses around the clock, every single night, for years. Microphones woven into smoke detectors throughout nearly every room, recording conversations she claimed were installed for home security purposes, but which her own legal team had referenced in emails agents later recovered from a company server as tools for monitoring compliance with the wellness plan. Every single room in that glass mansion had been quietly converted into a surveillance chamber, every space stripped bare of privacy, every word and every heartbeat cataloged and reviewed by someone, somewhere. Except one small, unremarkable server room tucked into the basement, the one place Derek had quietly, secretly preserved for himself over the years, disguised carefully as nothing more than a routine network maintenance closet. It was down there, surrounded by humming servers and blinking status lights, that my son had found 4 uninterrupted seconds of true privacy in the middle of one desperate night, just enough time to send one single cent and 4 impossible words to the only person on earth he still trusted enough to actually come running. Agent Whitman crouched beside Derek on the staircase, speaking to him gently, professionally, the way I imagine he'd spoken to hundreds of fraud victims over the years who had finally found the strength to say the truth out loud after months or years of silence. "I need you to tell me, in your own words, what's been happening to you," he said. "Take your time. Nobody's rushing you, and nobody's going to interrupt you." Derek's eyes filled finally with something other than that glassy chemical distance. He described the mornings he couldn't remember, the meals that arrived already prepared, already portioned, with a small pill dish set beside the plate that Selina insisted was simply his daily supplement regimen, approved by a doctor he'd never once been allowed to speak with directly, only ever hearing about secondhand through her. He described losing track of days entirely, waking up disoriented on a Thursday, convinced it was still Monday, and being gently, lovingly told by his wife that this was simply part of his condition, that this was simply what recovery looked like, that he needed to trust her, because nobody else understood him the way she did. I stood in that kitchen and listened to my son describe, in halting, exhausted sentences, the architecture of his own captivity, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable, that every polished headline written about Selina Cole over the past 3 years, every glowing profile, every award for compassionate leadership, every panel she'd been invited to speak on about balancing empire and empathy, had been built directly on top of his suffering, monetized and marketed as her virtue. Selina, meanwhile, had gone quiet for the first time since I'd arrived, watching agents move through her home with the flat, calculating stare of someone already rehearsing a legal defense, already recalculating which lawyer to call first, already treating her own husband's testimony as nothing more than a new variable to be managed. Even now, even caught, even exposed, I could see her mind working the numbers instead of feeling a single ounce of what should have been shame. Whitman finally turned to her, his voice carrying the flat, procedural weight of a man who had delivered this particular sentence more times than he probably cared to count. "Selina Cole, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful administration of a controlled substance, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." For one brief final moment, as the handcuffs closed around her wrists, her composure returned entirely, that same camera-ready calm settling back over her face, like a mask sliding perfectly into place, as though some part of her had already begun rehearsing the version of this story she planned to tell a jury. The trial took place 7 months later, in a federal courthouse 2 hours from the glass mansion that had once been Derek's prison. Selina arrived each day with a legal team of 6 attorneys, each one billing more per hour than most people earn in a week, all of them working tirelessly to reframe a documented, methodical campaign of drugging and financial exploitation into something softer, something more palatable, a marriage under strain, a misunderstanding between medical caregivers, a devoted wife who had simply made difficult decisions under enormous pressure while managing a partner's fragile mental health. It might have worked, too, against a less thorough case. Selina Cole was, whatever else she was, genuinely brilliant, and her attorneys were skilled at the particular alchemy that turns documented cruelty into a sympathetic narrative for a jury conditioned by a lifetime of stories where women are never the architects of that kind of harm. But 30 years of chasing financial predators had taught me exactly what kind of evidence a jury cannot argue their way around, and Agent Whitman's team had built precisely that. Bank records showing the $40,000 payment to a disbarred doctor, timed 2 weeks before a legal filing that stripped Derek of his own decision-making authority. Internal emails where Selina's own general counsel had advised that accelerating the capacity determination would streamline a funding round, and her one-word reply, "Perfect." Prescription logs showing dosages that no licensed physician would ever have approved for a healthy 34-year-old man. And perhaps most damning of all, Derek's own testimony, delivered slowly, painfully, but with a clarity that grew stronger with every question, describing in his own words exactly what 4 years of chemical captivity had cost him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours after 4 years of quiet, methodical cruelty, after months of federal investigation, after a trial that stretched across 3 grueling weeks. I remember sitting in that gallery, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone white, watching the foreperson rise to read the verdict, and feeling 30 years of professional detachment simply evaporate the moment the word guilty left her mouth for the first count, and then the second, and then the third. Selina Cole was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful administration of a controlled substance, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, along with a judgment requiring full restitution of Derek's company and the algorithm she had spent years quietly maneuvering to steal out from under him. The judge, reading the sentencing statement aloud, specifically noted the calculated and prolonged nature of the defendant's deception, language that felt, after everything, almost insufficient to describe what I had personally watched happen to my son, but which I understood, in a courtroom, was about as close to justice as the system was built to offer. I watched Derek during the reading of that verdict, seated beside me in a suit, that hung slightly loose on a frame still recovering its weight, his hands folded tightly in his lap, exactly the way mine were. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry, not right away. He simply exhaled, one long, slow breath, as though he'd been holding it for 4 straight years and had only just now remembered how to let it go. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, cleanly, with justice fully served and the world finally seeing Selina Cole for exactly what she was. But I've spent too many years in courtrooms and newsrooms to believe in endings that clean. The coverage that followed her conviction still, infuriatingly, softened the edges of what she'd done. One prominent headline described her as a fallen tech visionary undone by a troubled marriage. Another called her story a cautionary tale about the pressures of Silicon Valley success, as though 4 years of deliberate drugging were simply an unfortunate side effect of ambition rather than a calculated crime. Nobody wrote the headline that told the truth plainly. A woman had identified a vulnerable, brilliant man, isolated him from every person who loved him, drugged him into compliance, and nearly stole a billion-dollar company built entirely by his own 2 hands. Nobody called her what she actually was. And I understood, watching those headlines roll in one after another, that this double standard, this deep cultural reluctance to name a beautiful, successful woman as an abuser, was itself part of the architecture that had let her operate in plain sight for years. Invisible not because she hid well, but because nobody was trained to look for a monster wearing her particular disguise. I thought often, during those weeks of coverage, about how differently this story would have been told if the genders were reversed. If a wealthy, charismatic man had isolated his wife, drugged her under the guise of medical care, and quietly maneuvered to seize her company through a fraudulent power of attorney, there would have been no debate about the headline. Nobody would have called it a cautionary tale about ambition. Nobody would have softened it into a story about pressure and difficult choices. It would have been named immediately and without hesitation for exactly what it was. My son had to fight twice as hard to be believed, first by the officers on that driveway, and then by a public that still struggles to imagine a man in his position as anything other than weak or complicit, or somehow responsible for his own captivity. Derek's recovery was slower than either of us expected, and far harder than I think either of us had prepared for. The medications Selina had forced into his system for years had done real, measurable damage, and detoxing from that chemical cocktail meant months of tremors, insomnia, panic attacks that arrived without warning in the middle of ordinary afternoons. There were nights I sat beside his bed the way I used to when he was 7 years old, and afraid of the dark, except this time the thing he was afraid of had a name and a face and a prison sentence, and no amount of reassurance from me could make the nightmares stop on command. A therapist, a real one, licensed and verified 3 separate ways before I'd let him anywhere near my son, worked with Derek twice a week for the better part of a year, slowly helping him untangle which of his own instincts he could trust again after being told for so long that his own mind was the unreliable narrator of his life. He rebuilt slowly. He started sleeping through full nights again around month 4, and I remember the morning he called me just to tell me, voice still a little disbelieving, that he'd woken up without a single memory gap for the first time since before the wedding. He started driving again around month 7, white-knuckled at first, gripping the wheel of an old truck I'd helped him buy, relearning a freedom that had been stolen from him one gentle, loving lie at a time. He regained legal control of his company, and with it, the algorithm he'd built from nothing. And within a year, he'd quietly begun rebuilding it into something entirely his own again, coding late into the night the way he used to as a kid in our garage. Except now every door in his life was one he'd chosen to open himself, and every camera in his new apartment, of which there were exactly 0, was a decision he'd made on his own terms. There were setbacks along the way, plenty of them, Moments I won't pretend didn't happen just to make this story tidier than real life ever actually is. A panic attack in a grocery store parking lot when a stranger's perfume smelled for one disorienting second, exactly like the signature scent Selena used to wear. A night maybe 5 months in when he called me at 2 a.m, unable to distinguish whether a decision he'd just made about a business contract was actually his own instinct or a memory of what Selena would have wanted, because 4 years of being told his judgment was unreliable had left scar tissue that didn't disappear just because the person causing the damage was finally behind bars. Healing, I learned watching him, isn't a straight line climbing steadily upward. It's closer to a chess match, full of setbacks and recoveries, patient and slow, one careful move at a time. I moved out of my condo in the city about 8 months after the trial and bought a small, unremarkable house with a wraparound porch about 20 minutes from where Derek had settled, nothing like the glass fortress that used to swallow him whole. No smart locks, no hidden microphones in the smoke detectors, just wood and paint that needed touching up, and a porch swing that creaked in a way I'd come to find comforting rather than something to fix. Derek comes by most Sunday afternoons now. We don't talk about Selena much anymore, not because the wound has fully healed, but because we've both learned that some things get smaller the less oxygen you give them, and some things you simply choose, deliberately, not to feed. Instead, we play chess on a small wooden table I built myself the summer after everything happened. The pieces a little uneven, carved by hands more used to holding tools than sculpting anything delicate. And it doesn't matter, because Derek always says the imperfect ones are his favorite anyway. Last Sunday, he beat me in 11 moves, something he hadn't managed to do in years back before any of this happened, and I watched him grin the way he used to grin as a kid after winning some argument he was far too young to actually be right about. It wasn't a grand moment. There was no orchestral swell, no dramatic music, nothing cinematic about it at all. Just 2 men on a porch, late afternoon light slanting gold across a chessboard, no cameras watching, no microphones listening, no one deciding for either of us what we were allowed to say or think or feel. I keep an old dented 1-cent coin in my pocket now, most days. I found it in a jar of spare change the week after the sentencing, and something about it stopped me cold enough that I've carried it ever since. A small, worthless piece of copper that once meant the difference between my son disappearing entirely into that glass cage and my son coming home. People who hear this story sometimes ask me if I ever plan to go back to that house in Palo Alto just to see it, just for closure. I tell them the truth every time. I never want to see that house again. But I'll carry that 1 cent in my pocket for the rest of my life, because it taught me something no 30-year career in fraud investigation ever fully managed to teach me on its own. That sometimes the smallest, quietest signal a person can send is the loudest cry for help there is, if only someone on the other end is paying enough attention to hear it. That's what freedom actually looks like in the end. Not silk robes or glass mansions or magazine covers celebrating your compassion. It's the quiet, ordinary right to make your own next move, in your own time, surrounded by people who never once needed you to be smaller, sicker, or more manageable in order to love you. If this story made your blood boil the way it still makes mine boil every single time I tell it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told. More families who fought their way back from exactly this kind of quiet, elegant cruelty. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And tell me honestly, did you see Selena's true colors coming before the twist? Or did she fool you too the same way she fooled an entire city for years? Like this video if you believe men deserve to be believed too when they say something is wrong, and share it with someone who needs to hear that love should never come with a leash. I'll see you in the next one.